Hi, everybody. My name is Rose Myron, and I am the director of the Newberry Library's Darcy McNichol Center for American Indian and Indigenous Studies. I want to thank you all for joining us and welcome you to today's program, Monumental Mobility, the Memory Work of Massasoit. For those of you who might be joining us for the first time or might be new to the library, the Newberry is an independent research library in Chicago with collections that span more than 6 centuries of human history in Europe and the Americas. And we've been free and open to the public since 1887. Unfortunately, at the moment, our building is closed due to COVID-19, but we are very excited to continue bringing you research and learning opportunities during this time through a range of digital resources, online classes, and virtual programs like this one. In the midst of the anti-racism movement happening all across the United States and the world, we really view our work in raising critical conversations in the humanities to be more important than ever. And in particular, we've seen many grapple with how history and historical actors are represented, particularly in statues and monuments. The conversation that Dr. Lisa Blee and Dr. Jean O'Brien will lead us through today features content from their 2019 co-authored book. And I think it will really encourage us to think further about how Native history in particular is represented and often erased in public history and public memory. So while this program is specifically about how a monument to Wampanoag leader Osamiquim was created, traveled, and how Native and non-Native people interpret this history within the public humanities, I hope that we can also all use it as an opportunity to more broadly think about how representations of history shape our present and the manner in which collective memory across the nation is forged. So before I introduce Jeannie and Lisa, I want to go over just a couple of logistics for the virtual nature of the program. This is a great chance to hear Jeannie and Lisa talk about this incredibly relevant topic, but it's also a great opportunity for engagement and a good time to ask them questions about their work, whether or not you've had a chance to read the book. So we're going to have some time at the end of the program for questions, and we encourage you to submit questions using the Q&A feature within this Zoom webinar. You can do that through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit a question at any time throughout the webinar, and we'll be monitoring those throughout the program and then moderating a discussion at the end. So with that, I want to introduce our speakers for today. Dr. Lisa Blee and Dr. Jean O'Brien are the co-authors of the 2019 book, Monumental Mobility, the Memory Work of Massasoit, which received an honorable mention for the 2020 National Council on Public History Book Award. Lisa Blee is an associate professor of history and the program director of cultural heritage and preservation studies at Wake Forest University. In addition to Monumental Mobility and several articles and book chapters, she is also the author of Framing Chief Leshai, Narratives and the Politics of Historical Justice. Dr. Blee has received several awards from the American Historical Association, the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Oregon Historical Quarterly, and the National Council on Public History. She currently holds the White Family Faculty Fellowship for Outstanding Teacher Scholars at Wake Forest University. Jean O'Brien is a citizen of the White Earth Ojibwe Nation and a distinguished McKnight University professor and Northrop professor at the University of Minnesota. She has published many articles and book chapters, as well as 3 books, one of which we'll be discussing today. The other 2 are titled Firsting and Lasting, Writing Indians Out of Existence in New England, and Dispossession by Degrees, Indian Land and Identity in Natick, Massachusetts, 1650 to 1790. Dr. O'Brien is also the co-editor of 3 volumes and a co-founder and past president of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. We are thrilled to have both of these outstanding scholars with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa to begin our conversation.
Great, thank you, Rose. And thank you all for being here and tuning in remotely. If you've been following the news, you've noted that among the remarkable events of the past several weeks, in direct response to the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers, is a resurgent activism in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement around monuments to slavery, white supremacy, and colonialism. Protesters in Bristol, England, tore down a statue to 17th century slaver Edward Colston and threw it into the harbor. The City Council of Plymouth, England, announced that it would rename a square and consider removing a statue memorializing notorious slavers as well. After Belgian protesters targeted the statue of King Leopold II, who killed millions in the Republic of Congo, the city of Antwerp removed it to a museum, nominally out of concern for public safety. These developments followed the announcement by Virginia Governor Ralph Northam that the statue to Confederate General Robert E. Lee would be removed from Monument Avenue in Richmond. This is an action currently blocked by a Richmond judge. And dozens of other efforts targeting monuments to the Lost Cause and racist oppression across 20 states. In Albuquerque, one man was shot when protesters who denounced a statue memorializing Juan de Onate, the despotic colonial governor of New Mexico who brutalized Pueblo peoples, were confronted by an armed militia. Police in riot gear broke up the gathering with tear gas, and the mayor determined the statue would be removed. Protesters in Richmond and St. Paul toppled statues of Christopher Columbus, and several other cities, including St. Louis, have taken preemptive action on their Columbus statues. Richmond activist Chelsea Higgs-Wise announced, quote, "We have to start where it all began. We have to start with the people who stood first on this land." Protesters in Boston beheaded the Columbus statue in the dead of the night last Wednesday, and Boston's mayor announced that it would be removed and put in storage, followed by conversations about its historical meaning and whether or not it would be reinstalled. This was not the first time or place, nor the last, that monuments to Columbus have been targeted. But this wave of protests and removals has a certain momentum. Richmond Indigenous Society member Vanessa Bolin stated that she came to demand the removal of the Columbus statue, not to hijack the protests over police brutality, but rather to, quote, "stand in solidarity." These and countless other anti-racism protests over monuments announce a dramatic resurgence of struggle over memorialization to white supremacy that spiked in the wake of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017 that resulted in the tragic death of Heather Heyer in an attack on the anti-racism protesters. These events in Charlottesville unfolded just as we were finishing our book, Monumental Mobility, the Memory Work of Massasoit, that interrogates public memorials implicated in the politics of colonialism and appropriation. In the preface to our book, we pause to suggest that the vital public engagement with monuments to white supremacy ought to be placed in dialogue with the monumental scaffolding around settler colonialism and historical figures such as Columbus, which seems to be ramping up right now. Monumental mobility is situated within the terrain of intense debate over the placement, displacement, and replacement of monuments to difficult histories. We take as our case study the statue Massasoit by sculptor Cyrus Dallin. Installed in Plymouth, Massachusetts in 1921 to commemorate the tercentenary of the landing of the Pilgrims, Dallin's statue was intended to memorialize the Pokanoket Massasoit as a welcoming diplomat who negotiated the first treaty with the English. As well, the Massasoit was a participant in the mythical First Thanksgiving that stands at the center of American national origin stories. And a brief note here, Massasoit is the Wampanoag word for leader. His actual name was Usimiquin, meaning yellow feather. The statue was commissioned by an organization called the Improved Order of Red Men. And if you are not familiar with the Improved Order of Red Men, it's an all-white fraternal organization, a patriotic organization. And they hope to demonstrate their patriotism through a bronze monument to Indians' purportedly peaceful embrace of the Pilgrims. But Massasoit, the statue, did not remain only in Plymouth. In our book, we trace the physical and narrative mobility of the Massasoit story through its inception and its movement in the guise of several unauthorized reproductions of the statue to numerous locations in the US, through a case of nefarious dealings in the fine art market, to illuminate how the statue's attachment to national origins did and did not move with the installations. Taking as its point of departure the replication of an original statue with the status of fine art, our book examines its mobility from multiple angles. It analyzes the original inspiration for the monument, its design, installation in various locations, dedication ceremonies in diverse places over time, how to understand its reception by audiences, including Indigenous ones, over time, and how it has and does figure in tourism, and importantly, how Indigenous public intellectuals have intervened in historical narratives around settler colonialism read through the Massasoit statue, which is our focus today. What we found was that the meaning of the statue, along with the story of colonization and the founding of the nation it was commissioned to invoke, continues to evolve in Massachusetts and wherever the copies wound up. The force behind these changed meanings are twofold: through the work of Indigenous intellectuals and the ways in which public history can reconfigure our relationship to the present through engagement with the past. The historical memory surrounding the Massasoit suggests the rich potential of Indigenous public historians to intervene in sanitized national narratives of origins. Can the statue prompt viewers to reckon with the structural violence of settler colonialism in commemorative landscapes? Or does it further entrench celebratory narratives of national origins? Our book is connected to that volatile debate, suggesting that monuments to settler colonialism ought to be part of the conversation about the place and meaning of historical monuments.
Indigenous interventions in New England public history have made steady inroads since the historic Day of Mourning protest in 1970 that came to be an annual event. These upended pilgrim-centered myths and have reverberated in the historic district of Plymouth and surrounding area, including in connection with one of the town's storied institutions, Plymouth Plantation. In our book, we turn to this living history venue and other New England public history sites and lots of other things to take up the work of Indigenous public intellectuals since the rupture of the inaugural Day of Mourning protest, including their connection to what was destined to become a fairly obscure 8-episode historical reality television series aired by PBS in 2004, Colonial House. These very different yet intertwined instances of public history, in addition to the memorial landscape in Wampanoag homelands, are all a form of time freezing, where guests and cast members and viewers, in the case of Colonial House, are prompted to strive to embody the past, a particular approach to closing historical distance and making visceral connections to the past. These sites also became places where Indigenous public intellectuals contested historical memory and forced direct engagement with the violence of settler colonialism in ongoing and dynamically reimagined ways. They also demonstrate the disjuncture between the impulse to freeze history, whether in 1621, the Massasoit statue, 1627 or 24, Living History of Plymouth Plantation, or 1628, reenacted in Colonial House, and the vital fact that Indigenous peoples are highly motivated to both embody this history and demonstrate in no uncertain terms that they are still here as modern people looking to the future. We now want to focus on a particular mode of embodying history to close the distance between the past and the present that came in the form of Colonial House. The series website declares, "Think colonial life was all about pious pilgrims, powdered wigs, and freedom for all? Think again. 24 modern-day time travelers find out the hard way what early American colonial life was really like when they take up residence in Colonial House," unquote. The cast of men, women, and children from the US and England arrives shipboard to an imaginary new world charged with building a profitable colony, using only the technology of the time. Though set in 1628 coastal Maine on Passamaquoddy land, Colonial House is clearly about recreating the landing of the Pilgrims in Plymouth and their struggles to build a colony, complete with staged encounters with Native people. This is a year after the Plymouth Plantation baseline year of interpretation of 1627, although they recently moved 3 years earlier to 1624. The parallels intended by this historical reality show are unmistakable, and it is no surprise that Plymouth Plantation played a leading role in shaping the series. It drew on experience from its personnel in building the village where it was set, and they served as living history experts along with counterparts in England. Cast members spent 2 weeks at the plantation in intensive training in the technology, material culture, and attire of the time. Staff built the structures and furnished them on location, familiar tasks for them, but now imparted to a people who would spend 4 months living the experience in a remote location and for the cameras. Linda Coombs, Aquina Wampanoag, and Ramona Peters, Mashpee Wampanoag, joined John Bear Mitchell, Penobscot, and Donald Suktoma, Passamaquoddy, as consultants for the series. Coombs and Peters are highly visible Native intellectuals, and they appeared in one of the most powerful of the episodes called The Reckoning, along with several Native people affiliated with Plymouth Plantation. It features a clan of Wampanoag traveling to visit relatives. In one of the most powerful and pointed exchanges inside the village, Wampanoag Nancy Eldridge chastises a fellow Native for accepting food from the colonists, which they had all agreed not to do. She sternly corrected him. "We just don't want it to appear like, happy Indians with the first Thanksgiving, because it wasn't like that at all. And if we were being treated in a good way, even today, and our land wasn't still being taken, we weren't still being thought of as unintelligent savages, then, I would say fine." Unquote. Following this tense exchange, the voiceover informs the reader relations between the colonists and Native Americans are romanticized in the traditional Thanksgiving story. It is commonly thought that in 1621, the Wampanoag joined the colonists in a friendly 3-day feast, unquote. Ramona Peters points out, we know that wouldn't have been the case, unquote, and would-be colonists acknowledge that that must be right. The voice-over adds detail Peters herself has highlighted to underscore her point. Quote, the real story is that 90 Wampanoag men showed up after hearing gunfire. Instead of war, they found the Plymouth colonists preparing for a feast. In the interest of diplomacy, the Wampanoag joined in, but the event was never to be repeated, unquote. And she subsequently informs the viewer about the day of mourning that has been held on Thanksgiving Day in Plymouth since 1970. This scene sets up one of the most soul-searching moments in the whole series. At a solemn meal in the evening, the colonists process their day. Paul Hunt, an Englishman who portrayed a servant in the series, laments, she kept mentioning the English and looked at me in particular, and she said, you guys, the English, came over here, and you did this and you did that. If she had said your ancestors, it would be one scenario. I just found that quite offensive, unquote. Carolyn Hines, who was at the time portraying the governor's wife, retorted that your society was the imperial power that colonized for 300 years half the world. So if you've got a little bit of discomfort about it, probably does you a little bit of good too. Nobody likes to have it pointed out that your people and your culture have been responsible for their suffering. We needed to have it pointed out though, unquote. Another participant assents. Carolyn continues, it suddenly sunk in a way that it hadn't up until then, that I'm going along with being an imperialist, unquote. Some murmur in assent. She adds, it didn't really sink in on me that I'm reenacting a whole system that I don't believe in and I disapprove of, and yet it's the roots of our nation, who we are, unquote. The group continues to contemplate, and not for the first or the last time in this series, Caroline gets the final say. She reflects that being troubled over the US in the context of the world by calculation post 9/11 prompted her to participate in the project. I thought how good it might be to go back and to relive an earlier, simpler, purer point in our national history. So here I am, and of course what I'm discovering is that there were no pure moments in our national history. This is not a pure moment. We were already moving in. We were already driven by greed and ambition, and we were willing to shove away the native people. So what was better then than now? Sniffles are audible. I don't know, unquote. The episode closes with silent contemplation over a fire. Excuse me. From the first episode, the intent of Native consultants and participants to confront efforts to freeze them in a sanitized past was revealed when Mitchell announced to the cast members, we have been through the largest genocide, the largest Holocaust on the soil of the United States. We are the recipients of all that death, and the Holocaust that happened on our soil was one of embarrassment for this country, unquote. The reckoning brings this Indigenous perspective into bold relief with the buildup to the confrontation in the village. The narrator foreshadows the action in the episode, announcing the natives are prepared to confront the settlers over the issue of colonization, unquote. Over the course of several scenes, the argument unfolds. Aquina Wampanoag Jonathan Perry points out, being here is a chance to represent our people, to show them that we are a continuing culture and a continuing people, a modern people, as well as having deep roots with our ancestors and to have our story told, unquote. In the same scene, Eldridge justifies Indigenous anger as legitimate, quote, especially when it seems like America and in general doesn't want our story to be told, unquote. Mashpee Alice Lopez illustrates the ongoing impact of the structure of settler colonialism by insisting Indian land is still being taken all over the country, and as long as you don't acknowledge Native people, then you don't have to acknowledge that you're doing anything wrong to anyone, unquote. The reckoning represents a crescendo in the collision of historical narratives about origins and a powerful rejection of frozen narratives that refuse to explain the origins and still reverberating consequences of the United States as a settler colonial nation.
Well, the quirky Colonial House project constituted a one-time media intervention that was largely ignored. Indigenous public intellectuals take up the work of overturning mythological ideas about history in the town of Plymouth on a daily basis. The memorial landscape in Plymouth, including the Massasoit statue, helps those who traverse it to make meaning of New England's and the nation's history. The town of Plymouth was built directly atop the 1,000-year-old Wampanoag village of Patuxet, a thriving community with an estimated population of about 2,000 in the first decades of the 1600s. Villagers were in occasional contact with Europeans, set on trading, slaving, and plundering along the coast. But starting in 1616, Patuxet was hit hard by waves of epidemics. When the Mayflower dropped anchor in the bay in 1620, the English colonists would have seen a village only recently evacuated, as the survivors sought refuge elsewhere. When English colonists erected shelters amidst the existing houses and grave sites, they claimed the renamed place in honor of the home they left behind. Nearly half the Mayflower passengers died that first winter. They were buried in a mass grave near the waterfront, now called Coles Hill, upon which a commemorative statue of a Wampanoag leader was erected 300 years later. This is a story about a place undergoing terrible suffering and loss. Yet the Massasoit statue and the Thanksgiving myth that later attached to this place cast a positive glow. This is a place composed of welcoming Indians and well-meaning pilgrims, making Plymouth into the birthplace of the nation. It is the story of peaceful colonization that the improved order of red men hoped to celebrate in cast and bronze when they commissioned the statue. A tourist to Plymouth today can easily access the pilgrim-centered story as we did on our research trips. By gazing upon a diminutive rock we are instructed to venerate, taking a tour with a pilgrim-clad guide who insists that the Patuxets gave away their land because they no longer wanted it. Not true. By listening to a visitor center volunteer explain that all of the native residents had died off, and we actually heard them say this, and by perusing the town's gift shops stuffed with depictions of happy pilgrims and Indians sharing a feast. The memorial landscape and dominant narratives of its history insist on maintaining a cognitive distance from the past that insulates visitors from uncomfortable truths, even as they purport to bring viewers closer to history by connecting them to hollow ground. Yet as we arrive at the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower's arrival at Patuxet this year, Wampanoag and other Indigenous public intellectuals have brought new energy to their engagement with this landscape to craft a more complicated and coherent depiction of New England's past. Unlike most of the memorial landscape in Plymouth, which freezes the town as an English place, these educators create ways to introduce visitors to long excluded experiences and perspectives. Tourists can now join Tim Turner on his native Plymouth tours, where Patuxet becomes visible and the crowded memorial landscape on the waterfront can be reevaluated from an Indigenous perspective. They can also visit museums, libraries, and Plymouth plantation programs that offer guidance and instruction in Wampanoag experiences in the 17th century and today. Visitors may feel discomfort that comes with new awareness of a more complex reality and history, but such an experience with historical memory does the work of closing the cognitive distance between the past and present. How and why do Indigenous intellectuals engage in this difficult and time-consuming public-facing work? The Indigenous public intellectuals we engage with in Plymouth are part of a progressive movement that insists Native people must be heard and have a role in shaping public understanding of the region's history. They're building upon the foundation of the Day of Mourning gathering, which we see as vitally important. The gathering began in response to an attempt to censor and exclude Indigenous voices. In 1970, the town of Plymouth invited Wampanoag activist Wamsutta Frank James to speak at an event marking the 350th anniversary of the Mayflower's landing. But upon reviewing James's planned remarks, the event organizers deemed his speech insufficiently celebratory and provided James with a speech of their own, which James refused to read, prompting the organizers to uninvite him. James made his way to Massasoit, the statue, and read his speech in protest to a gathering of fewer than a dozen people. Quote, "This is a time of celebration for you, but it is with a heavy heart that I look back upon what happened to my people. Massasoit and his people welcomed and befriended the settlers of the Plymouth plantation. This action by Massasoit was perhaps our biggest mistake." End quote. James organized the activist group United American Indians of New England following this incident, and they have held a national day of mourning at the statue on Thanksgiving Day ever since. As a young activist, Mashpee Wampanoag Paula Peters delighted in the Day of Mourning gatherings in Plymouth. And now, as we approach another anniversary of the Mayflower landing, Peters has led a Wampanoag team of designers, researchers, and interpreters in the creation of a traveling exhibit titled Our Story, 400 Years of Wampanoag History, aimed at non-Indian audiences. Peters and her team produced and toured exhibit panels starting in 2014 with the intention of adding panels every year up to 2020. The first, titled Captured 1614, presents the Wampanoag perspective on the slaving expedition of Englishman Thomas Hunt, who seized 27 men and boys from Patuxet and Nauset. Peters explained in a press release, Quote, "This is a critical piece of the history of Plymouth that can't be told accurately without a Wampanoag voice." Indeed, how else to explain initial distrust of the Mayflower passengers, and how Tisquantum, also known as Squanto, one of the men abducted in 1614 and returned home to Patuxet 5 years later, had learned enough English to greet the colonists. Another panel, The Great Dying, takes up the epidemic that wreaked such destruction starting in 1616. In addition to chronicling and contextualizing these historical events with straightforward text, the exhibit also includes a series of videos that pack an emotional punch. In a reenactment of the 1614 abduction, young Wampanoag men struggle against English captors on the beach, then sit bound and terrified in the ship's hull. In several clips, Wampanoag people, dressed in fur mantles and deerskin, relate the experience of suddenly losing husbands, brothers, sons, fathers. In one clip, Natana Hicks Greendeer wonders about the savagery of people who would snatch men from their families and imagines how her children will suffer without their father's presence. Viewers witness speakers dressed in period clothing expressing real emotions of grief. Peters told us that she did not direct the speakers to act in any prescribed fashion. She simply told them the facts and asked them to imagine themselves in such a situation. The Wampanoag interpreters modeled for viewers how to close the distance between the past and the present, to access both the emotional impact of a disorienting loss and the experiences of those who live with the knowledge of this history as part of their contemporary identities. We see these difficult histories, as presented in this and other Our Story panels, to be impactful for a number of reasons. First, the deeply researched exhibit engages viewers with themes of trauma and colonial violence in a deliberately non-confrontational manner. That is, the events are placed in their historical context, but the colonial legacies and evidence of Indigenous resilience are made accessible today as well. As Peters reflected on the positive public response to the exhibit and its intention to prompt viewers to question comforting narratives, she asserted the truth, quote, had to be told to them in a way that made them think. The second way in which this presentation is impactful is that the panels provide important context for understanding the place that the Mayflower passengers encountered in 1620 and the upheavals and crises that explain Osamequin's decision to forge an alliance with the colonists. The feel-good story of Indigenous acquiescence no longer makes sense when the story starts in 1614 and includes their perspectives. It is disrupting the teleological narrative upon which the quadricentennial is based. Which events matter to the identity of the nation, and who has the power to choose anniversaries worthy of commemoration? This is an ingenious way to contribute to the Plymouth 400-year anniversary programming, while also destabilizing its implied chronology and subverting its inherent narrative. The exhibit designers are both enlarging the historical consciousness of America's shared past and disrupting the assumption that history begins when the colonists set foot on the shore. Their interventions prompt visitors to wonder, what if we freeze a moment in 1614, 1619, or even 1970 and take a look around? What kind of world do we find, and what can such time travel teach us about contingency, resilience, and our capacity for change? We see Massasoit, the statue, as an important touchstone in public history that sets up a complex push and pull dynamic around the problem of historical memory. The Improved Order of Red Men erected it as a manifestation of their own historical distancing from the violence of the colonial encounter. And yet, as with all monuments, meaning comes from engagement with the statue and the story it is intended to fix in bronze. Our book asks, how effective has the Red Men's project been in the long run? What is the place of the Massasoit in time, in space, and in narratives of the nation? Does the statue secure the distance intended by the Improved Order of Red Men in the historical memory of this imagined foundational moment? What meaning do people make of the history in those distant locations where casts of Massasoit came to be mounted? Salt Lake City, Provo, Kansas City, Chicago, Spokane, Dayton. That's a tease for our book. To what extent do observers hold on to the historical distancing implicit in the narrative of the Massasoit that so profoundly elides the violence of settler colonialism? What we found illustrates how multivalent historical meaning-making can be in divergent places. This particular set of monuments to the Massasoit open a fascinating window onto the process of historical memory formation. or the crucial work that physical location and cognitive distance perform on historical memory. In these public history locations, Indigenous people insist on a reckoning with the past and the present that refuses narratives of frozen Indians in a place sanitized of the violence and trauma of settler colonialism. In all of these locations, historical memory is contested rather than resolved for once and for all. Historical meaning-making is revealed as dynamic, interactive, unsettled, open to interpretation. Indigenous people use the statue as well as locations of living history to explain settler colonialism as a structure that is Indigenous dispossession set loose at that moment and continuing as a system of oppression, rather than a singular event like the peace treaty or mutual defense alliance, depending on your perspective. In these senses, Massasoit opens a window not only on how to think about the distance between the historical moment and the present, but also the distance between the very different non-Indian and Indigenous projects of commemoration. For Indigenous peoples, there is a double distancing operating: the distance between the memorialized moment and now, and the distance between Native and non-Indian willingness to embrace uncomfortable histories. They refuse to be frozen in this narrative, but instead insist that the past be reckoned with in a way that includes their perspectives on history and the ongoing ramifications of their lives under settler colonialism. Imagined from these multiple vantage points, Massasoit finds a place in a highly mobile interpretive terrain that unsettles rather than fixes historical narratives in bronze and stone. The National Day of Mourning was born in response to a significant anniversary in settler memory. Yet it set in motion an alternative timeline that emphasizes Indigenous resilience throughout a shared past. In 1970, Wampanoag activist Wamsutta Frank James was disinvited from speaking at the 350-year anniversary because of his interpretation of the event. In response, he initiated a new timeline of Wampanoag protest and visibility, one that would be observed from that point forward in calendrical time. The next year, under the leadership of Wampanoag activists Tall Oak and Brian Miles, Plymouth Plantation established the Wampanoag program to be staffed by Native people. Linda Coombs recalled that establishing the program, which allowed visitors for the first time to, quote, hear our story from our perspective, was a knock-down, drag-out fight, but it was initiated as a direct result of the National Day of Mourning, end quote. It created the opportunity for generations of Wampanoag and other Native employees to conduct intensive research into the 17th century world and learn skills and techniques their ancestors had mastered. Coombs noted that when visitors were directed to the Wampanoag home site before entering the English village, beginning in the late 1990s, that just flipped the whole script. Visitors released their reverence for the colonists and demanded to know why the English stole Indian land. The effect was noticeable, Coombs recalled.
The long-term impacts of the Day of Mourning can be seen in other ways as well. The National Day of Mourning protests picked up urgency and attracted more militant activists in the 1990s. Marches through the city provoked fear of disorder that the town of Plymouth was anxious to quell. One significant result of negotiations between Plymouth and the United American Indians of New England was the installation of a plaque with an explanation of the Day of Mourning beside Massasoit. If our interviews with passersby in Plymouth are any indication, local residents and tourists alike have taken note of the plaque, and many have reflected on the alternative narrative of Thanksgiving and settler colonialism it explains. It was evidence in stone and metal that colonists did not disembark in a wilderness, that Indigenous people did not give away their land and then dutifully die off. For those paying attention to the plaque, the story of peaceful colonization stopped making sense. Ever since its installation, viewers moved by the plaque's words have taken this more complicated narrative home with them. The annual Day of Mourning protest and the plaque beside the statue change interpretations of Massasoit and disrupt the ritualized Thanksgiving mythology in Plymouth. And yet, as such episodes enter the larger stage of public debate, they suggest a reckoning with a violent and conflicted past still reverberating in the present is an ever-larging element of public consciousness as we're seeing today. As the mythologized origin of the nation and English settler colonial memory, Plymouth is a crucial site for disrupting the dominant narrative of Indian acquiescence and disappearance at the root of so many other memorial controversies across the US and elsewhere. On the occasion of the 400th anniversary of the Pilgrim's Landing, Wampanoag see an opportunity to teach people about the complexities of colonial history and foster an alternative temporal consciousness. Similar to the creation of the Wampanoag program at Plymouth Plantation, The Plymouth 400 board tasked with planning commemorative events for 2020 was formed in response to Indigenous protest. Linda Coombs recalled how the board invited Wampanoag perspectives, quote, because they really do not want to do what they did 100 years ago when white residents performed as Wampanoags in a pageant and Massasoit was installed on Coles Hill, or have a whole nother Frank James thing like in 1970, unquote. Wampanoag involvement in Plymouth 400 have resulted in the temporal reconfiguration of settler memory in two really interesting ways, we think. The first is to insist upon James' 1970 speech act as year zero of Wampanoag perspectives on the American origin story that will no longer be ignored or silenced in connection to settler colonialism. 2020 and this alternative timeline represents a 50th anniversary of the creation of the Day of Mourning rather than the 400th anniversary of a different event. The Our Story exhibit hits this point home with its final exhibit panel to be released this year, which focuses on the Day of Mourning gathering. If anniversaries help us to recall and ritualize memories in calendrical time, Wampanoags insist upon an acknowledgement of additional events in a shared history between Indigenous peoples and non-natives. We want to underscore how important this visibility is to New England Indians who still struggle mightily to have the general public acknowledge their existence and ongoing sovereignty at all. The second way in which Wampanoag elders and teachers have crafted a new historical consciousness around the Plymouth 400th anniversary is by the starting of our story exhibit in 1614 with the traumatic abduction. They insist upon moving the timeline back 6 years to more fully contextualize English-Wampanoag relations when the Mayflower Pilgrims founded their colony on the bay. This kidnapping and the epidemics that followed soon after formed, quote, a critical backstory to colonization and the roots of the American holiday, Thanksgiving, unquote. From the Wampanoag perspective, the agreement of mutual defense that Osamequan famously negotiated with the English can only make sense when taking into account the ways in which the slaving expedition and the epidemic devastated their ancestors, threatened their understanding of the entire cosmos, and weakened Wampanoag nation politically and militarily in the years immediately prior to the Pilgrims' arrival. Wampanoag educators have responded to the settler colonial narrative, particularly the myth of peaceful first contact and Thanksgiving, rather than exclusively crafting their own separate history in public protests, plaques, performances, and exhibits. They are engaging. They thus illustrate the creative potential of directly confronting a deeply painful history of settler colonialism. While the disruptions to settler memory may focus on undoing myths, challenging narratives of disappearance, and especially addressing the anniversaries of the peaceful founding of the nation, Wampanoag historical interventions have been generative and creative rather than simply passive or reactionary. The decades of work of Indigenous people that have gone into flipping the script on this history in Plymouth reverberate out, illustrating how memorial interventions can foster dialogue about the legacies of settler colonialism far from the New England coast. In spring 2017, a protest erupted in Minneapolis over a controversial interactive sculpture called Scaffold, installed in the Walker Art Center's sculpture garden. The white multimedia artist of the piece, Sam Durant, who had grown up near Plymouth, intended his work to represent the gallows used in executions of political dissidents, freedom fighters, and Native Americans, specifically the 38 Dakota men hanged in Mankato, Minnesota after the devastating US-Dakota War in 1862 to explore issues of inequality, race, and state violence in US history. The design of the scaffold was based on the heinous device built specifically to hang all 38 Dakota warriors simultaneously. But Dakota protesters argued the artwork trivialized a traumatic event in their history. Viewers could walk on and off the scaffold without having to grapple with the deep pain the executions inflicted in the region. Quote, "This is a murder machine that killed our people because we were hungry," unquote, said Sam Wounded Knee, Crow Creek, Dakota. Durant listened to Dakota elders and agreed to remove the piece and sign over the intellectual rights to the Dakota Nation. As he recalled from the conversations, the Dakota people basically saw something that looked like a monument to their massacre, unquote. Durant admitted that he had not understood the local context, included the fact that the state history textbooks had only acknowledged the forced removal of the Dakota people in 2015. The legislature had decided over the protests of Native citizens not to relocate most of the artworks in the state capitol Senate chambers glorifying cultural and racial superiority over the Dakota Nation, and a controversy had arisen over how to commemorate the bicentennial of a military fort built on a site of Dakota spiritual significance that served as an internment camp for Dakota women, children, and elders after the Mankato execution. Although the details of local history are specific to the region and the Dakota Nation, such controversies over the persistence of settler memory in public spaces, halls of government, commemorations, and historical narratives can be found across the US and elsewhere. As he reflected on his evolving awareness of the presence of the colonial past, Durant recalled witnessing a protest on Plymouth Rock in the early 1970s when he was quite young. It was the United American Indians of New England. They were saying, "Hey, America, this is a catastrophe for us, not a celebration. It's a day of mourning." I remember thinking, oh, there's another side to this, unquote. As he saw in Plymouth and belatedly learned in Minneapolis, acknowledging that the nation has been built on dispossession and violence involves an uncomfortable dealing about the structure of power that continues to shape collective memory in place and in time and everywhere, really. Durant's failure to anticipate the heart-wrenching responses of Dakota people illustrates the power of settler memory to isolate and expunge heinous moments of violence while leaving antiseptic national narratives intact. For Durant, in this particular moment, colonialism was effectively a singular event rather than a structure, underscoring the power of settler colonialism to erase its ubiquitous pulverizing of indigenous peoples, places, and rights. So it's not that straightforward. Indigenous people have taken on the task of reframing Massasoit and placing the story of what they interpret as the Sachem's Mutual Defense Agreement within a larger context of Indigenous suffering, survival, and resilience. The monument thus serves as a site of intervention, an opportunity to disrupt settler memory and install an alternative temporal consciousness. Wampanoag people have held a National Day of Mourning protest at the site of the statue since 1970 as a way to embody counter-narratives to Thanksgiving Day celebrations that violate Indigenous understandings of settler colonialism rooted so particularly in Plymouth. A revisionist marker installed next to Massasoit addresses the violence unleashed upon Indigenous people after the English arrived, effectively closing the cognitive distance between Osamequin's time and our own. With these interventions, a space can open up for reconsideration of history and identity, and viewers have the opportunity to grapple with discomfort and new forms of memory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeannie and Lisa. I think that you have given us a lot to think about, and we're going to open it up for questions now. So in case you joined us a little late, I want to remind you that you can submit questions using the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to be monitoring those questions and asking Lisa and Jeannie to answer as many as we can in the time that we have left today. So Lisa and Jeannie, I want to start by asking you to place the Massasoit statue within the context of other statues a little bit. This is obviously something that we've been seeing a lot in the news right now. And I think a lot of people are wondering, you know, where does the statue, the Massasoit statue, fit in terms of other statues of Native people or statues that portray Native history? So are there lots of other individual Native people that have statues, or is it more common for us to see things like pioneer monuments or monuments that celebrate colonialism in one way? And maybe, Jeannie, you could start by talking to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the Massasoit statue is in some ways unique because it is the product of a very fine and well-known, world-known sculptor, Cyrus Dallin, who was just a fine artist. And he also is famous for other Indian statuary that he sculpted and are erected across the country, including a replica in Lincoln Park in Chicago, actually. So he's known for his Indian cycle and other depictions of Native people, and they're beautiful pieces of art. So there's that, and he's kind of sort of unique in that way, I would say. There's all kinds of generic statuary to Indian people, though, across the US. And one of the things that we found in doing our research is that these cheap statues that get to be made in the early 20th century that get erected in cities all over the place tend to take on the persona of a local famous Native person. So there's a range of statuary. So I guess I would start there.
Yeah.
Lisa, would you add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think backing up a little bit too, the period from about, I guess, the last quarter of the 19th century into about the interwar period was when we see a lot of monuments put up in public spaces. Monuments to the Confederacy, monuments to World War I veterans and other veterans, but also a lot of Indian statuary. And that's because of some developments in casting. So there was a new technology that came about in the mid 19th century that enabled cheap bronze casting. And so cities around the country, they wanted these cheap public statues for their public squares. And that's actually why you have so many kind of replicas of generic figures in many cities across the country. It was sort of a nationalizing movement and moment. Also in that period, there's a lot of immigration, a lot of changes and anxieties about the changing nation. So this kind of replication of a generic form was really appealing across the country. And I'll just add there that what we found out too in our research was that we do have these statues like the Massasoit that are public art, these big heroic size sculptures, but seems like for each one of those, there's maybe 1,000 small statuettes that were cast in terracotta and sold for the, I guess, private homes and offices. So we do have Dallin statues and these Indian figures probably all over the country, and the sort of density that we can't quite get our arms around. But I think people in this country have been really become familiar with the Indian statue figure because of these reproduction methods and their prevalence in public spaces.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And, building off of that, we have a lot of questions coming in, but one question that kind of follows up on this is about the broader history of Indigenous made monuments. So, similar to the Day of Mourning plaque or other sort of Indigenous public interventions in public history. And so, Jeani, I wonder if you could tell us a little more, are there any similar plaques to the Day of Mourning that you know about that happen in other places, or where does that sort of intervention fit within how Native people are engaging with public history and using it as a way to educate people about colonialism and settler colonial history?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. One of the things we did concentrate on was on the different plaques in the different locations where we found the statue. And we also very much concentrated on the fact that this particular plaque that the United American Indians of New England managed to have installed in Plymouth really seems to have an impact, and to try to use that as a way to try to enter the dialogue about how to think about what to do with monuments. And is this a problematic monument or not? That's a complicated question because it really does have the status of fine art. It's a beautiful statue. And Dallin did all kinds of interesting research in deciding how to craft it and all those kinds of things. So it's a little bit different than these other generic things that we see. But the signage, we think that it's worth talking about signage as a way to intervene, that it can potentially be one way of thinking about what we do with the complexity of historical narratives colliding.
Yeah, and Jeani, as you were speaking, I was thinking about our trip to Plymouth, where we saw that the United American Indians of New England had also put up a plaque that provided their perspective on the murder of Metacomet and the King Philip's War, right? So they offered an alternative interpretation in a place that's full of monuments, right? Where you have a lot of tourists coming and they're looking for these monuments. So those particular interventions are, we think, pretty highly effective.
What's interesting too about the placement of those is because Massasoit is on the top of Coles Hill. You have to walk up a bunch of stairs to get there. So you have to bother to do that, to see that narrative, but you have to bother even more to get to the King Philip's War monument, which is way up the hill from there in front of the post office.
Yeah, so another question that has come in that I think is interesting for us to think about in this moment is, as we're having these conversations about what should happen to monuments, right? Jeani, you mentioned that this isn't such a complicated, or this isn't such an easy fix to say, take it down, keep it up, there's lots of conversations around that. But in all of the work that you've done around this and all of the way that you've studied all of these interventions, who do you think needs to be involved in the conversations? Who do you think are the key stakeholders as we're having these conversations about monuments and what should happen with them? And Lisa, I don't know if you want to start us off on that, just given the work of the United American Indian Nations of New England.
Well, I don't. I think listening sessions are really important, right? And I'm not sure that I could identify, stakeholders in each community, but that's the work that needs to be done in each community, right? I see the role of city council in creating a space, perhaps, but it needs to be an open space, right? And a sort of safe space. For sure, the monuments to racist oppression have done the work of silencing people for a long time. And so part of the value of having conversations about those monuments now is allowing people to be heard and their perspectives to be heard on what those monuments have meant to them, to walk under their shadow.
I would just add very quickly about what we learned in the town of Plymouth and in many other places is that it's a free marketplace of ideas on tourism. There's no regulations of the narratives that get told there. And so we went on this tour with the pilgrim-clad tour guide that you saw in one of our slides, and he is paying zero attention to that plaque and totally fabricating a history of Native people. And there's nothing to stop him from doing that. So that's another element to the whole kind of how we think about how these narratives do or do not get placed in dialogue and or clash.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I found most interesting about this book and this talk is the various forms that Native people are engaging with this narrative, whether it's tours, whether it's plaques. The Colonial House thing, I think, is just fascinating. And we have one person who's asking about that in particular, and does the participatory performance, the reenactment, and the fact that this was a reality show, does that sort of open up the ways in which we can think about ways to interpret history and reach different audiences? Did you both find that particularly effective as you were thinking about how this narrative has been transformed? Jeani, maybe you can start us off with that.
Well, I remember being absolutely fascinated with this series when it first came out. It just struck me as so strange. And then I went back to look at it carefully in the context of doing the research for this book. And I really, spent a lot more time looking at this episode of The Reckoning. And it made me think that real learning happened here. But the degree to which it happened was the degree to which people watched the show and it made them think, right? It made the participants think, I think, for sure. But how much of an impact that has on a viewership, it would have been good to be able to do some audience kind of polling, but of course that was impossible. We did look at some reviews of the series, which, didn't get us very far. It didn't get viewed really widely. So there's limits to those sorts of things as well. But I mean, I think Plymouth Plantation, the way that Linda Coombs talked about how, and her cousin Dryas Coombs, who works there now, how they've revised that experience, I think really is making a difference for people who go through that experience. So I can see it happening potentially in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, just kind of in general, right? I think what was effective for the participants in Colonial House was that they were uncomfortable and they really had to, kind of sit with it. And that is an option, but not, it's a difficult thing, right? For visitors to Plymouth Plantation to opt in to that discomfort. But that is where a lot of that learning can happen.
Yeah, absolutely. We're almost out of time, but I want to end on one last question that I think is particularly important as we're thinking about these statues, and that is the role of place when we're thinking about the narratives that are attached to monuments. And I want to end with this because it's a teaser for the book too, because there's so much more in the book about how this narrative travels or does not travel as the statue moves. And so I wonder if you both want to end by just thinking a bit about why statues move, and is part of the work that some of these Indigenous intellectuals have done actually to reattach the monuments to their places and really connect them with the real history of these spaces, especially because place is such an important component for Indigenous people and nations. Um, yeah, who wants to start?
I'll start with the kind of the last part of your question, Rose, about how Indigenous interventions have helped or not to reattach a statue to place, right? And I think the important thing that we found from the different installations of the Massasoit statue in different places is that where people engage with it, that's where it becomes part of the place and where you start to have conversations about whether this statue belongs or doesn't. That was one of the questions that we asked passerby of the statues in the different locations. Does this belong here? Mm-hmm. And what we found was for people who like saw it for the first time and realized that they were looking at the statue, they were like, yeah, I guess. I don't know, right? But for people who were familiar with the history of their own place, who knew that the statue was of a Native person from across the continent, they were more thoughtful in their answers, right? So they really kind of thought about it, and some of the controversies that sprouted up in places like Salt Lake City over the placement of the Massasoit opened an opportunity for Indigenous people to talk about what they thought of having this statue in this place, how they felt honored, represented, given a voice, being, had the ability to be seen, but also what was not made public because this, person who didn't belong there was being memorialized there instead, right? So that opportunity to open up conversation in different places helped to make the Massasoit statue belong or not.
We did encounter actually two people from Massachusetts in our interviews, which was really revealing. One was in Kansas City where the woman said, yeah, that's Massasoit. I don't know what he's doing here in Kansas City. And the other one was in the Dayton Institute of Art, where the person said, yeah, I'm from Massachusetts. He would have frozen to death like that. So that was really telling. I mean, people who are from Massachusetts know that statue and they knew it didn't belong where they were seeing it. So that was interesting too. But they were the only ones who really had any kind of deep engagement with who Massasoit really was without being, instructed to think about it.
Mm-hmm. And why statues move? I think the unexpected, for me, answer to that question doing the research was it's a lot about money.
Capitalism.
Yeah, capitalism. That's a lot of the reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you both. That is about all the time we have today for questions. I apologize for all the questions we didn't get through, but I really encourage you to pick up this book if you haven't read it already. It has given me a lot to think about. I think it will give you a lot to think about. And I want to thank you all for joining us for this very important conversation. A recording of this program is going to be available online if you'd like to listen again or to share it with friends and family. And I also want to encourage you to check out the Newberry Library's website and our social media pages if you're interested in attending more virtual programs like this. We are very much looking forward to welcoming visitors back to the Newberry as soon as it's safe to do so. But in the meantime, our next virtual program is going to be an interactive Newberry Library Trivia Night. We're very excited about that, and that's going to be held on Tuesday, June 30th at 6 p.m. Central. So I hope to see you all there. And I also want to encourage you to continue to help support Newberry programming. This program was free, and keeping our programs free really depends on and is made possible by generous donations. So if you like attending our programs and you're interested in continuing to tune in, I encourage you to consider supporting us at any amount so that we can continue to bring you this kind of critical humanities content. And as the message that you're seeing on your screen notes, if you make a donation through June 30th, it will be matched dollar for dollar. So it's really a lovely time to make a contribution and make your contribution count. So thank you again to our speakers, Jeani and Lisa, and thank you to all of you for tuning in. I hope to see you at our next program.